Are you deaf? Or do you people just not understand English?
Garrett Sloane sneered, his fingers snapping sharply right in front of her face. Invading her personal space with an aggressive burst of motion, he looked down at her gray housekeeping uniform with absolute disgust.
Let me explain something to you, sweetheart. A dark-skinned woman like you belongs in the back! Pushing a cart, not standing in my lobby looking like you just crawled off the street!
He lunged forward with a sudden burst of motion, forcing the air of confrontation, his hand sweeping fiercely through the frame to flick her name tag against her chest.
Look around you. This is a 5-star luxury establishment. Our guests shouldn't have to look at your kind while eating breakfast. Get your hands moving and drag your garbage to the service corridor before I have security throw you out on the curb where you belong.
The lobby went dead silent. Everyone watched the 56-year-old maid stand perfectly still, her back straight, taking the public humiliation without a single tear. Garrett smiled, thinking he had just put a nobody in her place. He had absolutely no idea. He didn't know that this very black woman signed his paychecks. He didn't know whose name was etched onto the deed of the multi-million-dollar building he stood in. The maid he had just mocked didn't just work there. She owned the entire empire. And Garrett Sloane had exactly 11 days left before his world completely collapsed. Welcome back to Black Stories, where dignity always wins and arrogance pays the ultimate price. If you're ready to see a corrupt manager get completely dismantled by the very person he looked down on, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's go back to where it all started and see how this undercover billionaire chairwoman took back her kingdom. To understand how a maid came to own an empire and why she was standing in that lobby, letting a man like Garrett Sloane snap his fingers in her face, you have to go back, way back. Because the story everyone will tell about this hotel is a story about a maid and a manager. The real story is older than that. It starts in a different building, on a different highway. In a year when a black woman couldn't get a loan from a single bank in the state, Cora Vance was raised in a 2-room rental off Route 9 in the low country of South Carolina by a mother named Bertie, who cleaned rooms at the Marbury Motor Lodge 6 days a week. Bertie Vance was the kind of woman who could strip and remake a bed in under 4 minutes and never once let her face show what she thought of the people whose beds she was making. She worked doubles. She came home with her hands cracked from bleach and her feet swollen in shoes she'd resoled twice. And every single night, no matter how late, she sat on the edge of Cora's bed and told her the same thing. They can look down on you all they want. Baby, that's free. Don't cost them a thing to look down on you. But don't you ever let them make you small in your own mind. You can clean a man's floor and never once be beneath him. You hear me? Never once beneath him. Cora heard her. Cora carried it her whole life. At 14, Cora started cleaning rooms beside her mother to help with rent. She learned the work in her bones. The right way to fold a corner. How to make a cheap room smell like somebody cared. How to disappear into a hallway when a guest came out so they'd never have to see her. She learned something else. 2. She learned how the world treated the woman pushing the cart. Guests who left messes that took an hour and tipped nothing. A manager who docked her mother's pay for a stained towel that was already stained when she got there. A man in room 12 who grabbed Bertie's wrist one night. And the way the front desk shrugged when she reported it. Like it was weather. Cora watched all of it. She filed all of it away. And somewhere in those years, in a 14-year-old's heart, a single hard promise took root and never left. One day, I will own a place like this. And nobody who works for me will ever be treated the way they treat my mother. She didn't say it out loud. She just kept it. She kept it through community college. Paid for shift by shift. She kept it through the years she spent at the front desk of a downtown hotel. The first black woman they'd ever put out front. Working every position they'd let her touch. Reservations. Banquets. Accounting. Night audit. Because she wanted to understand the whole machine. She kept it the day a bank officer slid her loan application back across the desk without reading it and said, "We're looking for operators with a track record." She had 11 years of track record. He looked at her hands. She kept the promise. She found the money, the way black women have always had to find money. In pieces. From people who believed her when institutions wouldn't. A retired contractor who'd watched her run a hotel's restaurant out of a hole. A church investment club. A second mortgage on a house she didn't really own yet. Her first property was a failing 19-room inn that the previous owner had run into the ground. Cora bought it for almost nothing and rebuilt it with her own 2 hands and a crew she paid in full and on time, even when it meant she didn't pay herself. She did the books at night. She made the beds when the housekeeper called out. She learned that if you treat the people who work for you like human beings, they will carry your business on their backs, through storms that bury your competitors. The inn made money in 18 months. She bought a second, then a third. She named the company Belrose. Belle, for her mother's middle name. Rose, for the single rose bush Bertie kept alive in a coffee can outside their 2-room rental. The one beautiful thing they owned. By the time Cora was 40, Belrose Hospitality Group owned 14 hotels across the South. By 50, it was 31 properties and a brand that meant something. The place where the staff actually liked working. Where housekeepers got promoted to management, where the gratuity went to the people who earned it. All of it, written into the company charter in language Cora dictated herself. And the crown of it, the flagship, the one she dreamed about since she was 14 years old, pushing a cart down a motel hallway, was the Belrose, Charleston, a grand 1889 hotel on the historic waterfront. A building that had stood in that city through everything that city had been. All its beauty and all its sin. When it came up for sale, half collapsed and water-stained. Cora bought it and spent 3 years and a fortune restoring it down to the original brass and the original heart pine floors. The day it reopened, she stood alone in the lobby at 4 a.m. before a single guest arrived, put her hand flat against a marble column, and said, out loud, to nobody, "We own the house now. Mama." Then she went home and almost never came back. Because here is the thing, the business pages never quite figured out about Cora Vance. The richer she got, the more invisible she made herself. She gave no interviews. She sat for no photographs. She let the magazines run a 10-year-old picture and never corrected it. She built a leadership team she trusted. A CEO named Marshall Hines, she'd promoted from a front desk 20 years before. A general counsel named Camille Okafor, who was the sharpest legal mind she'd ever met. And she stepped back into the shadows and ran her empire through them. People in the company called her the chairwoman, and most of them, especially at the newer properties, had never seen her face. They thought it was eccentricity. It wasn't. It was strategy. Cora Vance had learned a long time ago that the truth of a place reveals itself only to the people it thinks don't matter. Put on a suit and walk into a hotel, and everyone performs for you. Put on a gray uniform and push a cart, and the place shows you exactly what it is. She kept one thing on her. Always. In the right pocket of whatever she wore, a small brass key fob, worn smooth, stamped with a single number. 9. Room 9 of the Marbury Motor Lodge. The room her mother cleaned the most. The room where Bertie had grabbed Cora's chin one afternoon, both their hands raw from bleach, and made her promise to never be small. The fob had come off the key the day the Marbury was demolished. A man Cora paid had pulled it out of the rubble for her. She'd carried it for 30 years. She had it in her pocket the morning she walked into her own flagship hotel in a gray uniform and let a man named Garrett Sloan snap his fingers at her. So that's who she was. Now let me tell you why she came back. It started with a letter. Not an email? A letter. Handwritten. Sent to the corporate address and routed up the chain until it landed on Camille Okafor's desk. And from there into Cora's hands. No name on it. The handwriting was careful. The kind of careful you use when you're scared. It said the writer worked at the Charleston flagship and that they could no longer stay silent. It said the gratuities that guests added to their bills, the 20% service charge on banquets, the tip pool, all of it, were not reaching the people who earned them. It said black and brown staff were being kept in the back of the house and written up for things white staff did every day. It said a head housekeeper with 21 years had been passed over 6 times for a promotion that always went to a younger white man with 2. It said the general manager ran the place like a private kingdom, and that anybody who complained was gone within a month. It ended with one line that went into Cora, like a needle, I think, Miss Cora. Vance would be ashamed of what this hotel has become. If she ever knew, I don't think she'll ever know. Cora read it 3 times. Then she set it down on her kitchen table and sat very still for a long time. The way she did when something hit a place in her that was older than she was. The numbers backed it up. When she had Camille quietly pull the flagship's reports, the surface looked fine. Revenue strong. Occupancy high. Guest scores good. But Cora hadn't run hotels for 30 years without learning where the bodies get buried. Staff turnover at the flagship was nearly triple any other Belrose property. The exit interviews were strangely empty. Like someone was conducting them with a hand over the mouth and buried in a 3-year-old HR file that should have triggered a full investigation and somehow never had. There was a formal complaint from a front desk agent named Renata Hill. A black woman. Gone. Now. Describing exactly the pattern the letter described. The complaint had been received by the company's VP of Operations, a man named Phil Ostrander. And Phil Ostrander had marked it resolved. No action required, and filed it in a drawer. Because the Charleston flagship was the highest earning property in the company, and Phil Ostrander had decided, like men have decided forever, that peace was cheaper than justice. Marshall, the CEO, wanted to fly down with a team and audit the place. Camille wanted to send investigators. Cora said no. They'll perform for an audit. She said, they'll perform for a suit. I've watched men like this my whole life. The only way to see the truth of that hotel is to be the kind of person it thinks it can step on. She looked at the two of them across the table. I want a uniform. I want a name that isn't mine. And I want 2 weeks before anybody at corporate so much as drives past that building. Camille started to object. Cora held up the brass fob, turned it once in the light, and put it back in her pocket. I started in a uniform, she said. I can finish a fight in one. So, they built it carefully. A temporary housekeeping placement. Arranged through a staffing agency, Belrose used so it left no corporate fingerprints. The name on the badge, Cora Banks, common enough to vanish into. The flagship's GM had never met the chairwoman and never would have recognized her from the decade-old photo if it landed on his desk. The plan was simple. Watch, document. Don't reveal a thing until she had it all. Every dollar. Every name. Every act. Cold and clean and impossible to explain away. Camille gave her one piece of advice before she went in. The kind of advice that turns out to matter. Let them build it tall. She said, whatever they're doing, don't stop it early. The taller they build, the lie. The harder it falls when you pull the floor out. Cora nodded. She already knew. She'd been pulling floors out from under men like Garrett Sloan in her imagination. Since she was 14 years old, on a Monday morning in the gray hour before sunrise. Cour avance. Chairwoman of a company worth more money than Garrett Sloan could count. Owner of the building? Of the marble. Of the brass. Of the floor he stood on. Clocked in through the service entrance of her own flagship hotel using a temp badge, and a man at the loading dock looked her up and down and said, "You, the new girl, you're late. Move it." And Cora Vance said, "Yes, sir," and moved it. And the fight began. The hotel that the guests saw and the hotel that Cora walked into were two different buildings. Upstairs. In the light, it was everything she'd built it to be. The brass gleaming. The lobby grand. The staff in front smiling, their trained smiles. Downstairs. In the service corridors. It was a different country with different rules. The back hallways were hot and stripped of any of the care that covered every inch of the public space. The break room had a broken vending machine and a water cooler that had been empty for so long. The dust on it had a dust. And the people back there, the people who made the whole machine run, the housekeepers, the dishwashers, the laundry crew, the stewards, the maintenance men, were almost entirely black and brown. And they moved through those corridors with their heads down and their voices low. The way Cora had moved through the Marbury at 14. She knew the posture instantly. It was the posture of people who had learned that being seen was dangerous. She was assigned to housekeeping under a head housekeeper named Lorna Mathis, and within an hour, Cora understood that the anonymous letter had undersold the woman. Lorna was somewhere past 40, with hands like birdies and eyes that missed nothing. And she ran that floor with a quiet, total competence that Cora recognized because it was her mother's competence. Lorna could look at a room and tell you everything wrong with it before she crossed the threshold. She trained the new girls with patience and an ironclad standard. She covered for people when their kids were sick. She knew every guest's name on every floor she touched. She was, in every way that mattered, already managing that hotel. And in 21 years, She had never once been allowed to wear the title. The general manager's office had passed her over 6 times. Cora watched Lorna fold a fitted sheet into a perfect square in under 10 seconds and felt something move in her chest that she had to look away to hide. It was Lorna who introduced her to Theo. Theo Banks was 18 years old. He worked the back of the house. A steward, which is the polite word for the kid who scrapes the plates and hauls the bins and washes the things nobody sees, for $11 an hour. Plus a share of a tip pool he was about to learn. He wasn't actually getting... He was tall and thin and quiet. And he moved through the corridors, pressed close to the walls. The way Cora had learned to move, the way you move when the world has taught you that taking up space gets you hurt. He kept his eyes on the floor. When a manager passed, he went still, like a rabbit. He'd been at the hotel 2 years. He was supporting a grandmother and a younger sister on a steward's wage. And the first time Cora saw his face light up, the only time in those early days, was when Lorna mentioned, in passing, that Theo could cook. This boy, Lorna said, with a warmth she rationed carefully. This boy can cook circles around the line upstairs. You should taste what he does on his break, with whatever the kitchen throws out. Theo's whole face changed for half a second. And then a steel door slammed in the kitchen, and a voice barked his name, and the light went out of him, and he dropped his eyes and went. Cora watched him go down the corridor close to the wall. She had seen herself in Lorna. Now, she saw something else in Theo. She saw a kid who had folded himself up so small that the world had almost succeeded in making him disappear. And she made a decision. Right there, in a hot service hallway, in a uniform with another woman's name on it, that whatever else happened in that building, that boy was going to learn how big he actually was. But first, she had to understand the kingdom, and the kingdom had a king. Garrett Sloan had been general manager of the Belrose Charleston for 11 years and on the property for 18. He ran it the way certain men run things, when no one above them is watching closely and no one below them is allowed to speak. He had a court. An assistant general manager named Cliff Barrow, a hard, joyless enforcer who did Sloan's ugly work, a director of front office named Heather Vinson, who could be charming to the right guest and vicious to the wrong staff member in the same breath, a director of security named Dale Pruitt, who controlled the cameras and the incident reports and therefore controlled what the hotel's official memory said had happened. The 4 of them ran the building as a closed loop. They hired their friends into the good jobs and the good shifts. They wrote up everyone else, and they sat, all 4, on top of a money machine that Cora was about to take apart, screw by screw. The first crack she found was the gratuity. She found it because she was in the right place. Invisible. In a corner, folding linens near the banquet office, while a manager spoke too loudly on the phone. The way men speak when they've decided the help can't hear. The Belrose hosted big events, weddings, galas, corporate banquets, and every banquet bill carried a mandatory 20% service charge. Guests paid it believing, reasonably, that it went to the servers and bartenders and stewards who worked the event. Cora had written the policy herself. Years ago. In plain language, the service charge is distributed in full to event service staff. In full. She'd been specific on purpose. And standing there with an armful of someone else's towels, she heard Trip Langley. the food and beverage director, laughing into a phone about how the house retention on the last wedding had come in at a real nice number, and how Sloane wanted the spreadsheet kept off the shared drive. House retention. On a gratuity that, by the policy printed on the bill, belonged in full to the workers. That was the thread. Cora started pulling it. She couldn't pull it, as Cora Banks, a housekeeper, has no access to payroll. But Cora Vance had a general counsel and a CEO and the legal right to every record her own company generated. And over the next 10 days, in the dark hours after her shifts, she ran a second investigation in parallel to the first. Camille and Marshall quietly pulled the flagship's banquet revenue, its declared gratuity distributions, its payroll, its vendor contracts, and the picture that came together was uglier than the letter, uglier than Renata Hill's buried complaint, uglier than anything Cora had let herself imagine. For more than 4 years, Sloane and his court had been skimming the workers' money. The service charge that guests added in good faith, that Cora's own policy guaranteed to the staff in full, was being quietly split. A portion went to the workers, just enough to keep them from suspecting. The rest was retained by the house through a fiction Langley managed and Sloane approved. And a meaningful slice of that flowed back out through inflated invoices to a hospitality consulting vendor whose only listed officer, it turned out, was Cliff Barrow's brother-in-law. They were stealing from the lowest paid people in the building and routing it through a fake company. Across 4 years, the gratuities and wages diverted from the hourly staff came to $312,000. $312,000 taken out of the pockets of housekeepers and dishwashers and servers, people supporting kids and grandmothers on $11, $12, $13 an hour, and moved into the accounts of 4 men who wore suits and called it retention. Cora sat at her kitchen table at 2 a.m, the spreadsheets glowing in front of her, the brass fob in her fist. And she did not feel rage the way you'd expect. She felt something colder and older, and far more dangerous than rage. She felt the 14-year-old in the Marbury hallway, watching the front desk shrug at her mother. She felt the promise, and she made the spreadsheet into evidence and kept it, and she did not stop them. Because Camille was right. Let them build it tall. She kept documenting everything else. 2. Not just the money. The cruelty? She kept a small notebook now. The way her mother had kept a small notebook of the rooms she'd cleaned and the wrongs she'd been done. A notebook Cora had found after Bertie died and read on her knees on the floor. Cora wrote dates and times and exact words. The day Heather Vinson, at the front desk, made a black guest, a doctor in town for a conference, a man who'd paid for a suite, produce his reservation 3 separate times, and then asked, loud enough, for the lobby, whether he was sure he was in the right hotel, while waving a white guest past without a glance. Cora wrote it down. The day Cliff Barrow wrote Lorna up for insubordination because she'd asked, respectfully, why the banquet staff's tip-out was lower than the bill said it should be, and the way Lorna took the write-up without a word and signed it because she had 21 years and a pension 3 years away and could not afford to be one of the people who simply vanished. Cora wrote it down. The day she watched a maintenance man named Reuben, a black man in his 60s, who'd been at the hotel longer than Sloane, get talked to like a child in front of guests for a problem that wasn't his fault. She wrote it down, page after page. Bricks. Camille had called them. Cora was building a wall. There was one afternoon she'd carry with her for the rest of her life. She was wiping down a console table in the lobby. Close enough to see. Invisible enough to be ignored. When a black family came through the front doors. A father, a mother, 2 kids in their Sunday best. In town, for a graduation, carrying the careful, hopeful energy of people who'd saved for a nice hotel and were a little nervous about deserving it. Cora knew that energy in her bones, she'd worn it her whole young life. Heather Vinson met them at the desk with a face like a closed door. She made the father show his confirmation twice. She couldn't find the king suite they'd booked and paid for, and tried to slide them into a smaller room on a lower floor because of an issue with the reservation. An issue that did not exist. She spoke to them slowly. The way you'd speak to people you've decided don't belong. And she did it loud enough that the lobby could share in the lesson. The little girl, maybe 7, watched her parents get small in front of this woman. And Cora watched the little girl learn. Right there. In real time. The thing this country teaches, its black children far too early. We have to be twice as polite to be treated half as well. And even that might not be enough. And while it was happening, a white couple walked up 2 feet away, were greeted by name, handed keys with a smile, and sent up to a suite without a single question. Cora stood at that console table with a rag in her hand and her own 7-year-old self standing right behind her eyes. And she wrote it all down that night. Every word, every gesture, the king suite that vanished and reappeared, the smile that went one direction and the closed door that went the other. Because that, more than any spreadsheet, was the real theft. And it didn't show up in any ledger. And she found, in the back of the house, the same thing she'd always found in the people. The world tries to make invisible, not weakness, dignity. Reuben, the 60-something maintenance man, had worked in that building for 26 years. Longer than Sloane. Longer than anyone. He knew the bones of the place. Every pipe and panel, and the temperament of a boiler that had been there since before the renovation. He'd been talked to like a boy in front of guests more times than he could count. And he'd taken it. And Cora watched the way he took it, and understood it wasn't surrender. It was a man choosing, every single day, not to let small men decide who he was. One night, she found him alone in the basement. Repairing the very heart-pine floor Cora had spent a fortune restoring, on his knees, doing it right, doing it beautiful. For a hotel that had never once said his name with respect, "Why do you stay?" she asked him. Quiet. Reuben didn't look up from the floor. "Because I'm good at it," he said simply. And a man's got a right to be good at something, no matter who's signing the check or how they talk to him. They don't own that part. That part's mine. Cora went home and wrote that down too, and underlined it, because it was the whole story in one sentence. And because it was, almost word for word, something her mother used to say. And the whole time, she watched Theo disappear a little more each day. And she started, quietly, to bring him back. It happened in small moments, because that's where it always happens. She started eating her break in the back stairwell where Theo ate his. Alone. Hidden. The first day, she just sat near him in silence. The second day, she said his cooking smelled like something her mother used to make, and meant it because it did. The third day, she asked him where he learned to cook like that, and he told her, in a voice he clearly wasn't used to using, that his grandmother had taught him, that he'd wanted to go to culinary school his whole life, that he'd applied to one downtown and gotten in, and then had to turn it down because there was no money. And his grandmother's medicine came first, and his little sister needed shoes, and dreams were for people who could afford them. He said it flat, like he'd made his peace with it. But he hadn't. And Cora could hear that he hadn't. "Why do you walk close to the wall?" she asked him once. Gently, he looked at her like no one had ever noticed. "So nobody sees me," he said. "If they don't see you, they can't come at you." Cora was quiet for a moment. Then she said the only true thing she had to give him. The thing her mother had given her in a room called 9. "Theo, they can make you invisible if you let them. That's a trick they do. But invisible isn't the same as small. You hear me? You can walk through this whole building unseen and still be the biggest man in it. The day's coming you won't have to choose. But until it comes, don't you ever be small in your own mind? Not for them, not for anybody." Theo didn't fully understand, but something in him heard it. The way Cora had once heard her mother. And he sat up a half-inch straighter on that stairwell step. And that half-inch was everything. It was Theo, in the end, who handed Cora the last piece, though he never knew what he was handing her. Because Theo, it turned out, was the writer of the letter. He'd written it 3 months before. Terrified. Certain it would change nothing. He told her about it on the stairwell one night. Not knowing who she was. Just needing to tell someone. "I wrote to corporate," he said, ashamed of himself. "To Ms. Vance, the owner. I thought maybe she didn't know. Stupid. Right. Rich lady like that? She's never even been here. She doesn't care about a dishwasher." Cora had to look at the floor for a long moment before she could trust her voice. "I bet she got it," she finally said. "I bet she cares more than you think." Theo shrugged, like a kid who'd stopped expecting the world to come through. "Maybe," he said. "Doesn't matter. Nothing's gonna change. Sloane's been here forever. People like him don't lose." Cora put the brass fob in her pocket and held it. "People like him always think that," she said, "right up until they're wrong." Then the thing happened that turned Cora's cold patience into a clock. It was a Saturday. A big wedding in the grand ballroom. 400 guests. The kind of event where the 20% service charge alone ran into 5 figures. Money that, by the printed policy, belonged to the workers running themselves ragged to make it perfect. Cora had been pulled to help turn the room. And in the middle of the chaos, with guests arriving and the staff stretched to breaking, Garrett Sloane decided to make an example of someone. The way men like Sloane do when they need to remind everyone who they are. He chose Theo. Theo had been double-tasked. Pulled from the dish pit to help bus a pre-reception, then yelled at by Cliff Barrow for being slow in the dish pit he'd been pulled out of. When Theo tried, quietly, respectfully, to explain, Sloane materialized like he'd been waiting for it. What happened next happened in front of staff and a scatter of early guests in the corridor outside the ballroom. Sloane got in the kid's face. He told him he was lazy. He told him he was lucky to have a job. He told him and Cora was close enough to hear every word. Close enough that her hand closed, white-knuckled around the brass fob in her pocket. That your kind always wants something for nothing. And that Theo should go back to wherever you came from and stop expecting the rest of us to carry you. He said it loud. He said it to make the corridor hear it. And then, because Theo's eyes had filled and the kid was fighting with everything he had not to let the tears fall in front of all those people, Sloane laughed. He laughed at an 18-year-old boy. He was paying $11 an hour and stealing from on top of it. And he said, "Oh, are you gonna cry? Look at this. The dishwasher's gonna cry." And Cliff Barrow laughed with him. And Dale Pruitt, standing by the ballroom doors, smirked at the cameras he controlled and made sure they were pointed somewhere else. Theo didn't cry. He pressed his lips together, dropped his eyes, said yes, "Sir," and walked back to the dish pit close to the wall. And the corridor went back to its business, like nothing had happened. Like a young man's dignity hadn't just been taken apart for sport in front of 40 people who needed their jobs too much to say a word. Cora stood very still against the wall, with a tray of glassware in her hands. And in that moment, she understood that the time for patience was running short, not because she was angry, though she was, but because she finally understood what this kingdom did to people day after day, year after year, and she could not be a part of letting it run one more week than it had to. That night, she called Camille and Marshall. "How much more do you need?" she asked. "We have it." Camille said, "We have all of it. The money, the vendor, the buried complaint, the write-ups, the turnover, cura. We have enough to end his career and possibly his freedom. The question is how you want to do it." Cora looked out her window at the lights of the city she'd dreamed of owning a piece of since she was a girl. "I want to do it in front of everybody," she said. "I want every person in that building who's ever been made small to be standing in the room when it happens. I started in a uniform. He's going to find out what was under it in front of all of them." But here's the thing about men like Garrett Sloane. They have an animal sense for danger. And in the days after the wedding, Sloane started to feel the floor shift. He didn't know why. He just knew that the new housekeeper, the older black woman, kept turning up in places a housekeeper had no reason to be. Near the banquet office, near accounting, near the loading dock at odd hours. He noticed her asking Lorna questions. He noticed she didn't flinch the way the others did. And Garrett Sloane, who had buried problems for 18 years by the simple method of making the problem disappear, decided to make this one disappear too. He went to Pruitt. He told him to tidy up, to archive certain incident reports, to pull certain footage, to make sure the official memory of the hotel was clean. Archive was the word he used. It's a polite word for delete. And he told Cliff Barrow to find a reason, any reason, to terminate the temp housekeeper named Cora Banks and to write up Theo Banks one more time. The third time. The number that let you fire a man for cause. He wanted them both gone by Friday. He wanted the floor steady again. He had no idea he was sweeping the deck of a ship that already had a hole in the hull. Because the records he was archiving, Camille already had copies of. The footage he was pulling, Cora had photographs of the incident reports. It was supposed to support, and the move to fire Theo, that was the last brick. Retaliation against the author of a protected complaint against a worker for asking a lawful question about his own wages. Camille actually smiled when Cora told her, "He's not covering his tracks," she said. "He's laying them in concrete. Let them build it tall." Cora made one more decision before the end. She found a quiet moment with Lorna. Lorna, who'd carried that floor for 21 years, who'd been passed over 6 times, who'd signed every unjust write-up because she couldn't afford not to. Cora couldn't tell her who she was. Not yet. But she could give her something. "Ms. Lorna," she said, "I need you to do something for me. Friday morning. Whatever you hear, wherever they tell the staff to go, you make sure every single person in the back of this house is in that room. The dishwashers, the laundry, the maintenance crew, räuben, all of them. Don't let anybody hide in the corridors." "You tell them," Cora said. "Be in the room." Lorna looked at her a long moment, with those eyes that missed nothing. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. Cora held her chase. "I'm somebody who made a promise a long time ago," she said. "Friday, you'll see me keep it." Lorna didn't ask again, but she nodded. Slow. Like a woman who'd waited 21 years for a Friday and had started to believe it would never come. Now, let me stop the story for 1 second, because I need you to sit in this with me. Picture an 18-year-old kid. Picture him so scared of being seen that he learned to walk pressed against a wall. Picture him scraping plates for the price of nothing, sending the money to a grandmother and a baby sister, turning down the one dream he ever got accepted into because medicine and shoes come first. Now picture a grown man in a suit standing over that kid and telling him to cry for the entertainment of a hallway, telling him his kind wants something for nothing, while quietly pocketing $300,000 of that kid's tips. And picture 40 grown adults watching it happen and saying nothing, because the same man could take their jobs too. If that doesn't put a fire in your chest, check your pulse, because that's the part of this we have to look at square. It's not just the one cruel man. It's the silence. It's the system that makes silence the smart move. Hold that. Now, watch what happens when somebody finally isn't afraid. Friday morning, 8 a.m. A mandatory all-staff meeting in the grand ballroom of the Belrose Charleston. The official story Sloan had been given was that corporate was sending a leadership team for a routine operational review and recognition event. He'd been told, through a carefully managed channel, that the flagship's strong numbers were going to be celebrated. And Garrett Sloan, who had spent 4 years stealing those numbers into existence, walked into that ballroom believing he was about to be praised. He wore his best suit. He'd told Cliff Barrow it was probably about his promotion to regional. He stood near the front with his court. Barrow, Vinson, Pruitt, Langley. The 5 of them clustered together like they always were. Comfortable. Certain. Kings surveying their kingdom. The room filled. And it filled with everyone. Because Lorna had done exactly what Cora asked. The front of house staff in their crisp uniforms. And behind them, filling in, taking up space they'd never been allowed to take up before the back of the house. The housekeepers, the laundry crew, still smelling of steam, the dishwashers, the maintenance men, räuben, 60-something, hands folded in front of him. Lorna, near the middle, her chin level, and near the back, against the wall, out of pure habit. An 18-year-old steward named Theo Banks, who had no idea why he'd been told to be there, and was mostly just bracing for it to be bad. Then 3 people walked onto the small stage at the front of the ballroom, and the room quieted. 2 of them the staff didn't fully recognize, but understood instantly, were power. A tall man in his 50s, in a flawless suit. Marshall Hines, Chief Executive Officer of Belrose Hospitality Group. And beside him, a sharp-eyed woman with a leather folder. Camille Okafor, General Counsel. Sloane straightened. This was his moment. He even started to step forward, ready to be recognized. And then the 3rd person walked onto the stage, and she was wearing a gray housekeeping uniform, and the name tag on it said Cora. For one full second, nobody understood. Sloane's face did something complicated. Confusion. Then the start of an ugly, incredulous laugh. The laugh of a man about to demand to know why the help was on his stage. He actually opened his mouth. Marshall Hines spoke first, and his voice filled the room. Good morning. For those who don't know me, I'm Marshall Hines. I'm the CEO of this company. To my left is Camille Okafor, our General Counsel. He paused. And I'd like to introduce someone many of you have heard of and almost none of you have met. The founder and chairwoman of Belrose Hospitality Group, the woman who built this company from a 19-room inn with her own 2 hands, the woman whose name is on the deed to the building you're standing in. He turned to her. Ms. Cora Vance. And Cora Vance reached up, and she took off the housekeeping name tag that said Cora, and she set it down on the podium with a small, deliberate click that the whole silent ballroom heard. And she looked out at the room, at the staff who'd shown her kindness, and the men who'd snapped their fingers at her. And she let the silence stretch, the way her mother had taught her, because silence is the loudest thing a powerful person can wield. The blood drained out of Garrett Sloane's face. Not red. White. He'd snapped his fingers at this woman in his lobby. He'd called her sweetheart. He'd asked whether her kind even understood English. He'd told her a woman like her belonged in the back, pushing a cart. And she owned the back. She owned the front. She owned the marble and the brass and the floor under his $300 shoes. And she owned the job he was standing in. And the look on his face was the look of a man watching the ground he'd been certain of his whole life turn out to be a trapdoor. My name is Cora Vance, she said. Soft. Avon. The same voice she'd used in the lobby. 3 weeks ago, I walked into this hotel in this uniform, and I clocked in through the service entrance. And a man at the loading dock told me I was late, and to move it, and I did, because I wanted to see something. I wanted to see what this hotel becomes when it thinks nobody important is watching. She let that land. I've spent 3 weeks in the back of this house, where most of you live, and most of these gentlemen never go. And I'm going to tell every person in this room what I found. In order, so nobody can say later that they didn't hear it clearly. Camille opened the leather folder. On my first morning, Cora said, the general manager of this property, Mr. Garrett Sloane, snapped his fingers in my face in the middle of his lobby and told me, in front of guests, that a woman like me belongs in the back, pushing a cart. He asked me, and I'm going to quote him exactly, whether my kind even understood English. He told me to drag my garbage to the service corridor before he had security throw me out on the curb where I belonged. He's right that there's a back and a front in this hotel. What he didn't say is who gets sorted into which and why. So let's look at the numbers. Camille placed a sheet on the podium. Of the 41 people who work the back of this house, housekeeping, stewarding, laundry, maintenance, 38 are Black or Latino. Of the people in management and the premium front-of-house positions, the ratio runs exactly the other way. That's not an accident. That's a sorting machine. And I built this company specifically, so it would never have one. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Brick 1. Brick 2. She said. Promotions. She looked out and found Lorna in the crowd. And her voice changed. Just slightly. Just enough. There's a woman in this room named Lorna Mathis. She's been a housekeeper at this property for 21 years. She trains every new hire on this floor. She knows every standard in this building better than the people who supervise her. In 21 years, she has applied for a supervisory promotion 6 times. She has been passed over 6 times. Every one of those promotions went to a less experienced white employee. I have the application records and the hiring decisions. Signed, Camille laid them down. A sound moved through the room. Not loud, just the sound of a lot of people realizing at once that something they'd known in their bones was true on paper. Lorna's chin was level, but her eyes were wet. Brick 2, Cora said. Brick 3 is the one that's going to put some of you in a courtroom. Cora's voice stayed even. And somehow, that made it worse. For the men at the front, every banquet at this hotel carries a 20% service charge. Our guests pay it, believing it goes to the servers and bartenders and stewards who work their events. It says so. In plain English, on every bill. Service charge, distributed in full to event service staff. I know it says that I wrote it. She let that sit. For more than 4 years, it has not gone to the staff in full. It has been split. A portion to the workers, just enough to keep them from looking. And the rest, call it house retention, which is the phrase Mr. Langley likes to use on the phone when he thinks no one's listening. The rest has been routed out of this property through inflated invoices to a consulting vendor whose only officer is Mr. Barrow's brother-in-law. The room had gone absolutely silent. Over 4 years. The money taken out of the pockets of the hourly staff of this hotel. Out of the pockets of housekeepers and dishwashers and servers. People supporting children and parents on $11 and $12 and $13 an hour comes to $312,000. She paused. $312,000. Stolen from the lowest paid people in this building by 4 of the highest paid and called retention. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman put her hand over her mouth. A server near the front said, out loud, to no one, that was our money. And the dam that had held for 4 years and 21 years and longer than that started, finally, to crack. Garrett Sloan found his voice. It came out wrong. Too high. Too fast. The voice of a man grabbing for a railing that isn't there. This is. Those numbers are taken out of context. That's a standard industry practice. The service charge isn't legally a gratuity. It's a charge. And the retention, Mr. Sloan, Cora didn't raise her voice. She just said his name. And it stopped him like a hand on his chest. I have run hotels for 30 years. I know exactly what a service charge is, and exactly what the law allows. And I also know what my policy says. Because I wrote it. And you signed an acknowledgement of it 11 years ago. Camille laid that down too. His signature on it. Don't explain the industry to me. I was cleaning rooms in this industry before you were born. The room, the back of the room especially, made a sound at that. Something between a breath and the beginning of a cheer. Cora held up a hand, and they quieted. Because she wasn't finished. And what was coming was the part that mattered most. There's a fourth brick, she said. And it's the one I want every person in this room to hear. Because it's the reason none of this came out years ago. She looked, for a moment, toward the back wall, toward an HR director and an operations man who'd flown in that morning and were sitting very still. 3 years ago, a front desk agent named Renata Hill filed a formal complaint describing everything I've just described. The sorting, the promotions, the retaliation. She filed it through the proper channel. In good faith. The way you're supposed to. And it reached the desk of this company's vice president of operations, Mr. Phil Ostrander, who marked it resolved. No action required. And put it in a drawer. Because this is the highest earning property in the company. And Mr. Ostrander decided that the money was worth more than the woman. Renata Hill was gone within a month. And the machine kept running for 3 more years. Cora's voice, for the first time, carried something underneath the calm. Something personal and absolutely controlled. I know what it is to file a complaint and watch it disappear. I watched my mother do it in a motel off Route 9 when I was a child. I built this entire company so that it would never, ever happen under my name. And it happened under my name. And that is on me. And on Mr. Ostrander. And it ends this morning. She set both hands on the podium. And then Cora Vance, owner of the building, owner of the marble, the maid they'd mocked, delivered the judgment. Garrett Sloan. He flinched. Your employment with this company is terminated. Effective this moment. Mr. Hines has your final paperwork. Our counsel is referring the financial conduct at this property to the district attorney's office and to the state labor commissioner. You will be hearing from both. Mr. Cliff Barrow. Mr. Trip Langley. The same. Terminated. Effective now. And referred Ms. Heather Vinson. Terminated. And your conduct toward guests and staff is part of the referral. Mr. Dale Pruitt, who'd spent the last week deleting footage, went gray. We have the records you tried to archive this week. We had copies before you touched them. Tampering with records that are now part of a criminal referral is its own crime. And you've added it to your file all by yourself. Terminated. Referred. She straightened. Security is at the doors. These 5 gentlemen will be escorted out of this building in the next 10 minutes. And they will not be coming back. The doors at the side of the ballroom opened. 3 uniformed security officers. Real ones. Brought in by Camille that morning. Not Pruitt's people. Stepped in along the wall. Sloan looked at them. And then he looked at the room. The room he had ruled for 11 years. And he understood, finally and completely, that not one person in it was on his side. His court was already shrinking away from him. Barrow stared at the floor. Vincent's mouth worked, but nothing came out. Langley had his face in his hands. Pruitt looked like he might be sick. And here is the part that tells you who these men were. As the security officers crossed the room toward him, Garrett Sloane, finished, exposed, escorted, turned toward the crowd, toward the back of the house, toward the people he'd stepped on for a decade. And he found Theo, 18 years old, against the back wall, and Sloane, with nothing left to lose, sneered at him one last time, because cruelty was the only language he had ever learned. He opened his mouth to say something vile. He never got it out, because Theo Banks, the kid who walked close to walls so nobody would see him, pushed off the wall. He took one step forward, into the open, into the light, where everyone could see him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just stood up straight, all the way up, in the middle of that ballroom, in front of the whole hotel. And he looked Garrett Sloane dead in the eye and refused, for the first time in 2 years, to be small. And Sloane, the man who'd made an 18-year-old try not to cry for sport, was the one who broke the gaze. He looked away. He let the security officers turn him toward the door. And the most powerful thing in that entire room was a dishwasher standing up straight. The ballroom erupted. It started in the back, where it always should. The housekeepers, the laundry crew, the dishwashers, the people who'd kept their heads down for years, who'd signed the write-ups and swallowed the insults and sent the diminished paychecks home. They stood, and they were not quiet anymore. Reuben, 60-something, put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled like a young man. Lorna Mathis put her face in her hands and wept. 21 years of it. And the women around her held her up. The front of house staff stood too. The ones who'd performed the smiles and seen the truth and said nothing. And some of them were crying, because complicity is its own kind of weight, and it had just been lifted off them. The whole room was on its feet. And in the middle of it, an 18-year-old kid stood straight and tall and let himself, finally, be seen. Cora Vance let them have it. She didn't quiet them this time. She stood at the podium in a gray housekeeping uniform with the name tag set down in front of her, and she watched a room full of people who had been made small for years stand up all at once. And she thought about a woman named Birdie cleaning room 9. And she put her hand in her pocket and held a worn brass fob. And she let one tear go. Just one. Because some debts take a lifetime to pay, and she had just made a payment on hers. When the room finally settled, and it took a while, Chora wasn't done. Because here's the thing. The black stories you scroll past, sometimes misfiring the bad man is not justice. Firing the bad man is the start of justice. Justice is what you build in the space where he used to stand. I need everyone to stay a few more minutes, Cora said, because I'm not finished. And the part that's left is the part that's actually about you. She laid it out, point by point, the way she did everything. Clear, specific, impossible to wriggle out of. First, the money, $312,000, was taken from the hourly staff of this hotel over 4 years. Camille and her team have already reconstructed, employee by employee, shift by shift, who was owed what, Every current and former hourly worker at this property is going to be made whole, with interest, going back the full 4 years. If you worked a banquet at this hotel in the last 4 years, a check is coming, and it's going to be bigger than you think. And it is not a gift. It is your money. That was always your money, being returned. We are tracking down the people who were forced out, including Renata Hill, and they're getting theirs too. The room reacted to that the way you'd expect, but Cora kept going, because the money was the floor, not the ceiling. Second, from this morning, the service charge on every event at this hotel goes to the event staff in full, the way the policy always said. And it's going to be visible. We are putting in a transparent gratuity ledger that every staff member can see. Every banquet, every dollar collected, every dollar distributed. No more retention. No more spreadsheets kept off the shared drive. The light goes on, and it stays on. Third, the sorting machine is getting torn out. Effective today. Every promotion and every premium assignment at this property runs through a blind, structured process. Qualifications and record. Scored before names are attached. And I'll tell you right now where it starts. She found Lorna in the crowd again, and the whole room turned to look. Ms. Lorna Mathis, 21 years, passed over 6 times. As of this morning, you are the Director of Housekeeping for the Belrose Charleston. With the title, the office, the salary, and the authority that should have been yours a decade ago, and the back pay to match the years you did the job without the name. Lorna's knees nearly went. The women around her caught her, and the back of the house roared. And Lorna Mathis, who had carried that floor for 21 years, finally got to set the weight down and pick up something else instead. Fourth, nobody in this company is ever going to file a complaint into a drawer again. We're putting in an independent ethics line that does not run through any manager at this property and does not run through Mr. Ostrander. Mr. Ostrander, by the way, is no longer with this company as of this morning. And the entire executive team is going to answer for how a complaint sat in a drawer for 3 years. Every report from any worker gets an investigation and a written answer. I should have built that years ago. I'm building it now. She paused, and her voice changed for the last point, because the last point wasn't policy. And fifth, she looked toward the back wall, where an 18-year-old was standing up straight. There's a young man in this room named Theo Banks. He's a steward here. He scrapes the plates. Most of you never think about. He sends his wages home to his grandmother and his little sister. And he is, according to the woman who just became your director of housekeeping, and according to my own 2 eyes, one of the best natural cooks in this building. Line included. A few people near the kitchen actually laughed and nodded, because they knew Theo got into culinary school. Got in, and he had to turn it down, because medicine and shoes come before dreams when you're holding up a family on a steward's wage. Cora, let that sit. That ends this morning, too. The Belrose Foundation, which I'm announcing the existence of right now, because I just decided it should exist, is going to pay for Theo Banks to go to culinary school. In full. And there's going to be a job in the kitchen of this hotel waiting for him when he's done, if he wants it. And he's not going to be the last. We're going to do this for one back-of-house worker at every Belrose property. Every year. For as long as I'm alive and after. She found Theo's eyes across the whole length of the room. So, she said, and her voice finally broke just a little. You don't have to walk close to the wall anymore. There's room for you in the middle. There always was. Theo Banks stood in the middle of the grand ballroom of the Belrose Charleston, 18 years old. And for the first time in his life, he did not try to make himself small. And he did not look at the floor. And he could not stop the tears now. And he didn't try to. And a room full of people he'd hidden from for 2 years stood and clapped for him until their hands hurt. By that afternoon, it was out. Not because Cora sought it. She's never given an interview in her life. But because a story like that can't be contained. Staff talked. People posted. By evening, the story of the chairwoman who'd gone undercover as a maid in her own flagship and torn out a corrupt regime root and branch was moving across the country. And the part that hit hardest, the part people couldn't stop sharing, wasn't the takedown. It was the dishwasher standing up straight. It was there always was room for you in the middle, and the consequences kept coming. The way real consequences do. Slow and grinding and total. The district attorney opened a case on the gratuity scheme and the fake vendor. Wage theft and falsified records are not minor things. And 4 men who'd called it retention learned what a courtroom calls it. Garrett Sloan, who'd been certain men like him don't lose, spent the next year discovering, in detail, that they do. The state labor commissioner opened an investigation that reached past the flagship into industry practice generally. Because it turned out the Belrose hadn't invented the gratuity scheme, only perfected it. And a lot of hotels, in a lot of cities, suddenly found their service charge accounting under a light it had never been under before. Phil Ostrander, who'd filed a black woman's complaint into a drawer to protect a revenue number, was gone. And the executives who'd let him operate that way answered for it in a top-to-bottom review that Camille ran without mercy. Renata Hill got her money, and an apology signed by Cora herself, and, when she wanted it, a far better job than the one she'd been forced out of. And the hotel changed. Not overnight. And not perfectly. Because nothing does. But the back of the house and the front of the house stopped being 2 different countries. The break room got a working water cooler, and then, because Lorna insisted on it, got nice. Got cared for. The way the lobby was cared for. Because Lorna ran her department on a single principle she'd learned from 21 years of being on the wrong side of it. The people who keep this place running deserve to be treated like it. Promotions started going to the people who'd earned them. The gratuity ledger went up on a screen in the back hallway, and the workers could watch their own money come home. And turnover at the flagship, the highest in the company for years, dropped to the lowest because it turns out people don't leave places that treat them like human beings. But Cora knew better than to think one cleaned-up hotel was a victory. One hotel is a story. A story is not a system. And the woman who'd spent 30 years building a system knew that the only thing that outlives a person is a standard. So she did the thing that would matter long after she was gone. Long after anyone remembered the name Garrett Sloan. She took everything she'd learned in 3 weeks in a gray uniform and 3 months of forensics afterward. And she wrote it down. Not a memo. Not a press release. But a charter. The Belrose Dignity Standard. Plain language. The way she wrote everything. the way her policies had always read. Every gratuity goes in full to the people who earned it. And the ledger stays visible. Every promotion runs blind. Every complaint gets an investigation and a written answer that doesn't route through the people it's about. The back of the house gets cared for like the front, and the people who hold the building up get a path to the middle of it. Sponsorships, training, a foundation seat at every property, funded forever. She published it, not quietly. She put her name on it. Coravance, who'd never signed an interview in her life. And she put it out into the world on purpose. And she dared the rest of the industry to read it. And the industry read it. Because by then the Labor Commissioner's investigation had pulled the cover off the gratuity skim across half the hotels in the state. And a lot of executives who'd called it retention for years were suddenly very interested in being able to say they'd always done it the Belrose way. Two competing hotel groups adopted versions of the standard inside a year, not out of conscience, but out of fear, which Cora considered a perfectly acceptable reason. Fear of consequences is just conscience for people who don't have one yet. A hospitality school in Atlanta built a case study around it. A state senator cited it in a wage transparency bill, and a worn brass key fob from a demolished motel off Route 9. Framed in a back hallway in Charleston under one line of brass letters, became a thing. That staff at other hotels started asking their own managers about, why don't we have something like that? The kingdom Garrett Sloan had ruled for 11 years didn't just fall. It became the reason 1,000 other small kingdoms got a little harder to run. That was the part Cora cared about. Punishing one cruel man feels like justice for an afternoon, making cruelty expensive. Making it a thing that gets you investigated and fired and sued and replaced by a standard with your victim's name on the masthead. That lasts. Cora Vance went back into the shadows. The way she always did. But she came to that hotel more often now. And every time she did, she went in through the service entrance first. Out of habit and out of respect. And she stopped in the back hallway, where she'd had a brass key fob welded into a small frame on the wall. Beneath a single line of brass letters she'd had made the words her mother said in a room called 9. The words that built an empire. You can clean a man's floor and never once be beneath him. 1 year later, almost to the day, Cora Vance walked into the Belrose Charleston for a small private event in the Grand Ballroom. The same ballroom where she'd taken off a name tag and ended a kingdom. The Belrose Foundation was hosting its first graduation dinner, honoring the back-of-house workers from across the company who'd been sent to school that year. Cora coming quiet. The way she does. No announcement. A simple navy dress, and the silver bracelet she always wore, and the brass fob in her pocket. She stood near the back, against the wall, out of an old Geufont habit, and she watched. The food that night was extraordinary. Every plate, and it was extraordinary because it had been cooked start to finish. By the first graduating class of the foundation she'd announced on a whim, in a moment of righteous fury, a year before. Lil, in the kitchen. By its first and most decorated student. A young chef, 19 now, in a white coat that fit him, moving through that kitchen, not pressed against any wall, but right down the center of it. Calling the line. Owning the room, the biggest man in it. Theo Banks came out at the end of the dinner to a standing ovation, and when they pushed him to the microphone to say a few words, he found Cora in the back, the way she'd once found him, and he spoke right to her. A year ago, he said, I worked in the back of this building, and I walked close to the walls so nobody would see me. I figured if they couldn't see me, they couldn't hurt me. I'd stopped believing anything was ever going to change. I thought people like the man who used to run this place don't lose. And people like me don't win. And that's just how it is. He swallowed. Then a woman in a gray uniform sat down next to me on a stairwell and told me they could make me invisible, but they couldn't make me small. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know she owned the whole building. I just knew she saw me when nobody else would. The room had gone still. She told me there was room for me in the middle. There always was. I didn't believe her. He looked down at the white coat and then back up, and his voice was steady and clear and not small at all. I believe her now. He raised a glass toward the back of the room. To the woman who proved that the people they look down on are the ones holding the whole place up. Ms. Couravance. And the room turned and found her against the back wall and stood. And Cora Vance, who started in a uniform and finished a fight in one, who was once a 14-year-old girl watching the front desk shrug at her mother, who built an empire on a promise and walked back into it as a maid to keep that promise, stepped out of the shadows into the middle of the room and let them see her. She put her hand in her pocket and held a worn brass fob stamped with the number 9. And she thought, we own the house now, Mama, and everybody in it gets to stand up straight. That's the story. And I told it to you for a reason. Because somewhere right now, there's a Garrett Sloan snapping his fingers at somebody in a uniform, certain the floor belongs to him, certain that the people he steps on don't matter and never will, certain that men like him don't lose. And somewhere there's a Theo, 18 years old, walking close to a wall so the world won't see him, holding up a family on wages somebody's quietly stealing, told every single day in 100 small ways that he should make himself small. And somewhere, this is the part that should sit in your chest. Somewhere there's a room full of people watching it happen and staying quiet. Because quiet is the safe move. Because the man who's cruel to the dishwasher can be cruel to them too. Here's what Cora Vance knew that they didn't. The people you look down on are the people holding the whole thing up. The maid knows where the money goes. The dishwasher knows who's really being stolen from. The woman pushing the cart sees everything. Because nobody bothers to perform for her. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not soon, but one day, the person you snapped your fingers at turns out to own the building. And when that day comes, the only thing that'll matter is how you treated her when you thought she was nobody. So here's my question for you, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments. Not just scroll. Have you ever been the one in the uniform? Have you ever been made small in a place that needed you more than you needed it? And stayed quiet, because speaking up felt like a risk you couldn't afford. Tell me about it. And the harder question, have you ever been in the room when it happened to somebody else? And said nothing, because the man who runs the kingdom only runs it as long as the room stays quiet. The day somebody stands up straight, the whole thing comes down. If this story put a fire in you, if you've ever been knocked down, looked through, or made to feel small in a place that ran on your back, do something with it. Stand up straighter today than you did yesterday. Treat the person in the uniform like they own the building, because one day they just might. And remember what a woman named Bertie Vance said to her daughter in a room called 9. In a year, when the world had decided they were nobody, you can clean a man's floor and never once be beneath him. Never once. If that landed, like the video. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it today. And drop your story below. I read them. Every one. Because the people they look down on have always been the ones holding up the whole world. And it's about time somebody said it out loud.